Okay, everyone. So we are going to be looking today at pesticides and pests and basically how those impact living things and different ecosystems. So before we begin, we'll kind of define what a pest is. So maybe, you find your little brother or your little sister a pest, or maybe you've been called a pest before by your older sibling. But it's nice to know there are no pests that exist in nature. So a pest is basically something that is competing or causing damage to crop species. So think of it as, a farmer, something that's annoying a farmer because they're trying to grow some crops, and there's this organism that is continuously damaging their crops. So it can be many different types of organisms. So, for example, a bunny rabbit can be seen as a pest if it's eating the lettuce, right? Or different types of insects. So there's many different types of pests, but essentially the definition is something that is competing with another organism or that's causing damage to crops. So both plants and animals can be pests. So a lot of pests you think of, like I was mentioning, maybe insects or mice or rodents, but weeds are a type of pest, right? So let's say your mom or dad or you have a garden outside in your backyard, let's say, and there's a whole bunch of weeds that keep popping up. That is an example of a plant pest. And the reason why it's considered to be that is because it's going to take away nutrients from the soil that would be going to your plants. So if you planted, let's say, 5 tomato plants and a bunch of weeds are there, they are going to take away nutrients from the soil by the weeds growing, and maybe your tomatoes are not going to come out as nice, or maybe your plant is not going to grow as well as it would have otherwise. So plants, like different producers, can also be considered to be a pest. Okay, but let's say we're going out in the wilderness. Of course, you still have those things that are growing. There is no such thing as a pest in nature. Everything has its place within an ecosystem, right? It has an ecological niche. It has its own role that it plays in a food web. So here are just some examples of some insect pests. So the gypsy moth caterpillar, the Asian longhorn beetle. This is also an invasive species. So you may have seen signs. I know a lot of the parks or areas where there's a lot of trees, like Oak Ridges Moraine, but in Richmond Hill, Vaughan, York region has a big problem with the Asian longhorn beetle. What they do is they basically will burrow into the trunks of trees and essentially strip away the nutrients, and then the tree ends up dying. So yeah, big problem. You may have seen a sign. Usually there's signs about them. And of course the spruce budworm that goes onto spruce trees. So pesticide. So what does this mean? So first of all, the ending "icide" means death. Okay, so when we say a pesticide, we're talking about something that is going to be used to kill or cause death to the pests. Okay, so typically it's a chemical that is either sprayed or added to the soil, depending on what type of addition it is, right? So sometimes it's usually a spray. So there are different types of pesticides, and it depends on what type of pest that it kills. Okay, so a herbicide kills producer pests. So this would be something you would add that you don't want any dandelions or weeds to grow. An insecticide is something that will kill off insects. A rodenticide is something that will kill off rodents. And a fungicide is something that will kill off various types of fungi or mushrooms, right? So actually, if you've ever seen a lawn that has a lot of mushrooms growing in it, usually what happens closely after that is the grass around the area where the mushrooms are start to die off, because for the same reason as the weeds, they strip away the nutrients from the soil that the grass would normally use. So types of pesticides. So when making the decision to use a pesticide, there are two kind of categories that they fall under. So one is a broad spectrum pesticide and the other is a narrow spectrum pesticide. Essentially, the difference between the two, a broad spectrum pesticide will kill a wide variety of species. So let's say we have, an insecticide. Okay, if I have a broad spectrum insecticide, maybe it kills off 4 or 5 different types of insects. Maybe it kills off beetles or worms or a bunch of different types of species of insects. Whereas a narrow spectrum pesticide is only a specific type of species. Or maybe our broad spectrum kills off 5 species and the narrow kills off only 2. It just means, kind of like what it sounds like, it's narrowing in on the types of organisms you want to kill off. So maybe we want to only kill beetles. You can buy a narrow spectrum pesticide that will only kill beetles. Or even a specific type of beetles, not all beetles, but maybe only 1 or 2 specific types of beetles. So obviously from an environmental standpoint, narrow spectrum pesticides are much better to be used than broad spectrum. You have a whole bunch of different insects that kill off. And then narrow spectrum, you're only causing an impact to a few species. Okay, so this area here, this next section is talking about an example of a broad spectrum pesticide that was used quite a lot a long time ago, prior to the 1970s. So the short form for this pesticide name is DDT. Okay, so DDT stands for, here's the full name, dichloro-diphenyl trichloroethane. Essentially, it's a chemical compound, okay, and it was discovered or invented, I should say, in 1939. Now, this was seen as something that was incredible to agriculture sectors everywhere. So it was essentially a chemical that was cheap. It was used in all different types of soil or water areas. It was persistent. So what persistent means is that it was long lasting. Okay, so for example, instead of having to spray, instead of having to spray the soil maybe once every 2 weeks, DDT was able to last a lot longer than that. So maybe now you can only spray once every month, and it's able to basically stay inside of the soil. So which was seen as a good thing, right? You don't have to do it as many times. However, it was found to be extremely toxic to insects. Now keep in mind, this is a broad spectrum pesticide, so meaning it's killing off a lot of different species of insects, and it was found to be non-toxic to humans and other mammals. So you gotta think, this sounds like it's pretty darn good, right? So it's cheap, we can use it for a whole bunch of different criteria, we can kill off a whole bunch of different insects, and we don't have to spray it as much. And on top of that, it's safe for us to eat the crops still, right? It's like a win-win. So just spoiler alert, okay, it's not as great as it sounds. Obviously, they found out some more information about it, but it's still actually used in some places today. So in the 1970s, there was a ban put in place that, in North America at least, they could no longer use DDT on their crops. And I'm going to explain to you why that was happening. But I do want you to know that it is still used in some parts of the world, especially areas of the world that suffer from a lot of malaria cases. Okay, so typically places where they have poor water quality and lots of mosquitoes. Usually it's very hot areas, such as South America or certain sections of South America, I should say, or Africa. They have lots of malaria. So what's happening is they're using DDT to basically kill off the mosquitoes. Okay, but let's talk about why this was so bad. Okay, so in the 1950s, Rachel Carson, an environmentalist, And actually, it's nice to actually hear from a female scientist. Normally, especially when we're looking at the atom, if you remember, there's a bunch of male scientists, okay? But in the 1950s, we have an environmentalist who started looking into what DDT was actually doing to different types of organisms. So not necessarily humans, but looking at other organisms that live in that ecosystem where DDT was being sprayed. All right, we found out some nasty things. So I'll give you kind of a picture description of what happened. Here's my grass. Okay, so here is my grass. Okay, and let's say there's a little insect in the grass, and we want this insect to die. I'll draw a bunch of them. Okay, so what they were finding, so let's say we spray the pesticide, okay, so these spiders or these insects are dead, okay? But what they found is organisms that were larger, okay, so let's say I have a big bird here, okay? So the organisms that were higher up in the food chain started to die. Okay, and they could not see a connection yet between the DDT that was sprayed on the grass and wondering why was it killing off this larger animal. So what happened and what Rachel Carson started investigating is a term known as bioaccumulation. And we'll talk more about this later, or bioaccumulating. So what they were finding, I want to change that, bioaccumulation. Okay, so what they found is even though they sprayed the lower organisms in this food web, DDT still made its way through the food chain. So let's say we have the grass that's being sprayed. Okay, so let's use some kind of numbers. So let's say each blade of grass has one DDT. I'll use a code. I'll just use the number 1. So imagine all of these grass, all these blades of grass were sprayed with DDT. So what happens is the insect eats the grass that's been sprayed and the insect dies. But let's say before the insect died, it ate 2 blades of grass. That means that now what was happening is that insect now has twice as much DDT as what was sprayed. Or let's say over here, right, this insect also ate 2 blades of grass. It also has two, like double the amount inside of its body. All right, well, let's add in another organism. Let's say there was, let's say, sure, a bunny. Okay, so let's say this bunny, yeah, that will still work. Okay, so let's say this bunny also eats the grass, and the bunny doesn't die when it eats only 2 blades of grass, and let's say the bunny now eats 5 blades of grass. The bunny has now 5 portions worth of DDT inside of its body. And actually, it's okay. Like, it's not dying. It's fine. The bunny is okay. That face is not a great face, but you'll get the point. So the bunny's cool, and it's winking at us. So the bunny is fine. Now, let's say another bunny is in the same situation and also has 5 within it. And this bunny's still alive also. Well, what happens is the higher organisms, let's imagine this is like a hawk or something that eats bunnies, okay? This hawk now ate, let's say, 2 bunnies and now has 10 times the amount of DDT. So what ended up happening is it eventually reached a high enough amount that the hawks or the higher level food chain organisms were dying off.